Meanwhile, the Public Service Commission PSC conducted unannounced inspections at selected primary and high schools in 8 of the 9 provinces during the first 2 weeks of June 2020. This was to assess compliance with the minimum health, safety and social distancing requirements in mitigation of the COVID-19 during the reopening phase for grade 7s and grade 12s. We speak to Commissioner Leonardo Goosen from the PSC, and he joins me now live via Skype. Good afternoon to you, Commissioner. Thank you so much for joining us here on the SABC News channel. Let's first get an understanding as to how these schools were selected by the Commission.
Good afternoon and good afternoon to your viewers. Yes, we, as a Commission, we have commissioners in each province, and our intention was to get a feel for the readiness across the board. So what we did was we selected schools in the urban setting, we selected schools in the rural setting, township schools, ex-Model C schools, so that we've got a good feel for the broad spread of the schools.
And what specifics were you looking into, and perhaps share with us your findings upon your visits to those schools?
Look, what we did was we looked specifically in respect of the norms for social distancing, so the extent to which from the gate of the school, the extent to which the schools were ready to do the screening at the gate, whether they checked the temperature, whether they had hand sanitizer on call, whether they had registers for people entering the premises, and whether there was one entrance to ensure that only people who had been screened could enter the schools. We then moved to the classrooms, and we had a look at the extent to which it would be possible to have social distancing, given the amount of learners, what plans there were in place in each institution to ensure that there was sufficient space between each learner. We had a look at whether there was protective gear issued, so your masks, your gloves for those who were cleaners at the school, and so on. We had a look at the areas where food was served, those who participated in the school nutrition program, and just generally looking what plans the schools were putting in place to ensure that that distancing was there and that we minimize the risk to both learners and staff. Now, we found that generally most of the schools were prepared, but for these just a few areas that we find these challenges, and we are on an ongoing basis engaging with the Department of Basic Education and with each provincial department. And so, broadly speaking, we found that there was PPE that was delivered. In short, in some cases, there was a shortage. And also there was the issue related to communication, whether this PPE and the cleaning materials was only for this phase of the reopening of the schools, or whether it would be for a longer period. That's the one issue. The second issue we found was that while school management teams and educators had put in place a system to ensure social distancing, this had led to them using a large amount of classrooms. So, for example, in the current phase, we're looking at grade 7s and grade 12s. In order to ensure that there is social distancing, most schools would have had to divide the grade 7 or grade 12 classes up, which meant that they used a huge amount of classes. In one instance, for example, one school that I visited, there's 180 grade 7 learners, which meant that they divided it into 10 classes. So not only is that using 10 classrooms, but also 10 educators. And so the challenge there is, of course, what happens when the rest of the grades return. How is that going to be managed? A third area where we found some challenges was in the issue of textbooks, because there are schools, and I'm speaking on a national, when I'm speaking nationally, there are schools where there's a shortage of textbooks and learners have to share textbooks. This will, of course, pose a challenge when one is trying to implement social distancing. And also, it leads to having the textbooks having to be sanitized and will impact negatively, we think, on learning.
But also, Commissioner, very quickly, if I can just come in there. So going back to the issue, the number of learners per class, I wanted to come in to say that this may spell trouble or difficulties once other grades are phased in at a later stage during this year. So we may be faced with a challenge of insufficient number of classes and educators at the same time once everyone starts coming back to school.
Correct. That is exactly what we had highlighted. Is that it's definitely going to, it's definitely, you just take the example that I gave, 180 grade 7 learners, taking up 10 out of 28 classrooms, taking 10 educators. That is going to be challenging when the next phase returns, because similarly, that grade needs to be divided as well. And it means that the social distancing will not be implementable. However, some schools have been innovative. And even at this phase, for example, they've said, look, what we do is we implement a situation where it's either 1 day on or 1 day off, or 1 week on, 1 week off. So they divide the grades up. So not everybody is there all the time. So that is some of the innovations that our people that the teachers on the ground have come up with.
All right.
But yes, definitely that will be a challenge.
So in some schools, there were no.
If I can just share the remaining 2 areas.
Yeah, because of time, I just want to.
In the rural areas, some of the rural areas.
Yeah, if I can just get to that issue very quickly, Commissioner, because we're running out of time. Let's just talk to some schools that do not have a proper water supply. Some schools still have pit latrines. What then happens after your visit? Will you be engaging the Department of Basic Education on this issue? What happens going forward?
Yes, that is exactly what I was coming to, especially in the rural areas. We would be engaging with the Department of Basic Education, yes. Bear in mind, our role is an oversight role, and we then make recommendations to the department. And it's for the department to implement. Of course, we also interact with Parliament and with provincial legislatures. And that is a further method of oversight to ensure that the department does what is necessary to put in place the measures to ensure distancing. Yes. So finally, there's the comorbidities I just want to speak to. That is a challenge because there doesn't seem to be in a lot of cases a clear plan of managing that. Many of our educators are over 60 and some suffer from comorbidity. So there doesn't seem to be a clear plan as to how we're going to manage that, because that will also impact the amount of teachers available for teaching, and also impact on how we implement social distancing.
All right, Commissioner, that's where we leave it, but thank you so much for coming through. That's Commissioner Leonardo Goosen. He is from the Public Service Commission, talking to us about the Commission having paid a number of primary schools and high schools a visit to see if they're compliant to the COVID-19 regulations. That's a story to follow up on, and we'll certainly be speaking to the Commission again at a later stage.